Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and I'm here for a second time today with Dr. David Benatar. He is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town in Cape Town, South Africa. The first time in our first conversation we focused mostly on his book Better Never to Have Been. I will leave a link in the description box for you to go there and listen to the interview. It's very interesting. We talked about anti-natalism. And today we're going to focus on another one of his books, The Second Sexism, Discrimination Against Men and Boys. So, Dr. Benatar, it's again a real pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back and speaking with you again.
Okay, great. So, my first question would be relating to the title of your book. Since it's called The Second Sexism, what is the first sexism? I mean, does it have something to do with the chronological order, because you're using first and second here, or does it simply relate to another kind of sexism that goes around in our societies?
Thank you. I didn't intend it primarily as a chronological claim. When I spoke about the first sexism, which is sexism against women and girls, I really meant the sexism that is first recognized, that's first known, that's first acknowledged. And the second sexism, I think, is one that is not often acknowledged, and I'm referring to that. It's also partly a play, obviously, on Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex. So whereas the first sexism is against the second sex, there's the second sexism, which is directed against the other sex.
Mm-hmm. Right. I asked you that question because there's that common idea that until recently, until a few decades ago, let's say the 60s, 70s or something like that, that only women were discriminated against, let's say, in societies throughout the globe. And then, I mean, if you are talking about the second sexism and discrimination against men and boys, maybe some people, for example, feminists, would claim that that's probably a new sort of phenomenon that men before weren't really discriminated against. But I mean, that's not exactly the idea that you are exposing in your book, correct?
No, you're quite correct about that. So I think that there have been manifestations of the second sexism for as long as there have been humans. So it's very ancient. It's probably as ancient as forms of the first sexism. That's not to say that, all things considered, I think that men have been as badly off as women have been. I'm not making those comparative claims. All I'm saying is that there is this other form of sexism. It's got an ancient pedigree. It may have been exacerbated in some way in more recent times, but it's not a chronological claim that I'm making.
Mm-hmm. Right. Could you tell us about your definition of discrimination? Because as far as I understand it, in your book, you refer to it, you define discrimination in a very specific way. So maybe it would be good for us for the audience to know about it.
Good. Well, I actually distinguish three things in the book. The one is disadvantage, the other is discrimination, and the other is wrongful discrimination. And then, of course, you could have wrongful discrimination on different grounds. So it might be on the grounds of a person's purported race, or their religion, or their ethnicity, or their national origin, or it might be on the grounds of their sex. And if you have wrongful discrimination on the grounds of somebody's sex, then I'm understanding that as sexism. But that's different from just discrimination. I don't think that discrimination per se is wrong. One example of this is if a medical insurance company, for example, will cover routine mammograms for women beyond a certain age, but they won't cover men beyond that age. Although they are discriminating between men and women there, it's not a wrongful discrimination because there's a relevant difference between men and women that would warrant that different policy. Now, if that same insurance company were to preclude every last man from coverage for mammograms, including men in whom it were medically indicated, then I think that would be elevated to the level of wrongful discrimination. But there's certainly instances where one discriminates between different kinds of being, different kinds of people, and it's not wrongful to do so. And discrimination itself, I think, is just different from disadvantage. I think there's certain disadvantages to being a male and to being a female. Not all of those are the result of any kind of agent treating people differently. They might just be differences in a natural allotment. One example that I give in the book is a condition called hemochromatosis, which involves an accumulation of iron in the body, and this affects men more than it does women, because women, at least in their reproductive years, have a certain amount of blood loss every month, and so the disease tends to affect men more than women. On the other hand, there's a disease that affects women more than men because of this dynamic, and that is iron deficiency anemia. And so those are just disadvantages of being male or female, but they're not the product of any kind of agent or society discriminating, whether wrongfully or otherwise, against people of different sexes.
I was asking in terms of wrongful discrimination, that is the thing that you focus the most on the book regarding men and boys particularly. It has to be something done by an agent intentionally, and it is mostly the result of something that occurs at a societal or political level. Would that be a somewhat correct definition?
No, I would actually disagree. First of all, I do not think that it needs to be intentional. So you could have entirely unintentional wrongful discrimination against somebody. It may even be subconscious, unwitting, so I don't think it needs to be intentional. Nor do I think that it has to be only at the societal level. I think you could have it at the societal level, but there could also be wrongful discrimination at an individual level. So I would remove those components of the understanding of wrongful discrimination that you've mentioned, but otherwise I think I'd agree with what you've said.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So in your book you go through several different types of wrongful discrimination in different domains. You talk about, for example, military service, men being the victims of violence, sexual assault, circumcision, family laws, things that happen on the level of education, life expectancy, and so on. Would you say that there are any common threads that run through all of these domains?
Well, perhaps let's just make a point of clarification first. So not all of those things you've mentioned, I think, are obviously the result of a wrongful discrimination.
Yes.
They may be, and they may be to varying degrees. The structure of the book is that I first lay out all the ways in which men are disadvantaged. And then I look at the question about whether that disadvantage is the product of discrimination, and more specifically wrongful discrimination. And some of it is, some of it isn't obviously so, but then I think there might be parallel points to be made in some of those cases about ways in which women are disadvantaged. So I think your listeners should just be aware that not all of those examples are ones that I would say clearly are instances of wrongful discrimination. I imagine we'll discuss that more as we go.
Yes.
But in terms of those underlying ideas, I think there are a number of underlying attitudes that people have that do explain why men are treated differently and sometimes disadvantageously in society. The one is that I think that male lives are often valued less than female lives. Now, not always, and not in all societies. There are clearly societies in which female lives are valued less. So it's not a universal claim, but it's a claim that applies in many instances. Another is that I think there's a greater acceptance of non-fatal violence against men than there is against women. Of course, it's not that the claim is not that violence against women is never tolerated. Clearly, there are societies that tolerate violence against women, but the claim is, at least in some societies, there's a greater tolerance of non-fatal violence against men and fatal violence against men than against women. And then there's some beliefs, I think, about men, which are actually also beliefs about women. So I think the belief is that men are more aggressive and violent than women are, that men are less nurturant and caring than women are. And there's a further question which I examine in the book about the extent to which those claims might be true, and if they are true, whether they're attributable to nature or to nurture. But those, I think, are the sorts of beliefs that underlie the differential treatments of the sexes.
Mm-hmm. So there are several different questions there for us to tackle. Let me just ask you one thing before we get into the specific examples. So you've already distinguished between disadvantage and wrongful discrimination. So, I mean, when it comes to disadvantages, let's say that at least some of these have a biological basis and they are not really caused by some people, by society, by the political system or whatever. Would you say that we still have to take these kinds of problems seriously? And I mean, if there are biologically based disadvantages, that we also have to talk about them and try to solve them in some sort of way?
I do think that. So if you think about a case of affecting women, so if you do, without modern medicine, women tend to die quite often in childbirth. And that's just a natural disadvantage, but it doesn't follow that society should do nothing about that disadvantage. I think that introducing proper obstetric care is an appropriate way to respond to that natural disadvantage. And those societies that have done that have brought down the female mortality rate quite significantly. Now, absent that issue, men tend to die more prematurely than women. So childbirth is the one area where women are more at risk. But if you look at all stages of development otherwise, right from the stage of fertilization onwards, more males die than females die at all ages. And so that, I think, seems to have a kind of biological basis, but it doesn't follow that we ought not to do anything about that if we can do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's now focus on a particular example that you explore in your book. Let's talk generally about instances of being victim of violence. So, because this is one of the topics that is probably the most explored by feminists when it comes to victims that are females, particularly, for example, when it comes to domestic violence and sexual assault and things like that. But in the book, you also try to raise awareness to the fact that it's not only women that are victims of these kinds of violence, it's also men, and perhaps we are neglecting at least a little bit this fact. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. I do want to emphasize that the claim is that it's not only women who are the victims. There are a lot of people who have tried to mischaracterize my position as denying that females are victims of all kinds of sexism, including violence and sexual violence. And that is categorically not my position. I recognize all the myriad and appalling ways in which females have been and continue to be the victims of discrimination. What I'm saying is there's another domain, another area, another form of discrimination, of sex discrimination, that's often not recognized. And we do have sort of different profiles for the ways in which women are discriminated against and the ways in which men are discriminated against. So it's probably the case that, at least outside of prisons, women are the greater victims of sexual assault. So the vast majority of victims of sexual assault are female. But that's not to say there are no ways in which men are the victims of discrimination with respect to sexual assault. So, for example, although rape of women and sexual assault of women is not taken sufficiently seriously, it's probably the case that sexual assault of males and rape of males is taken even less seriously. We can discuss some of the evidence for that in a while. So there's a way in which men are discriminated against with respect to sexual assault. But if we differentiate between sexual assault, sexual violence on the one hand, and violence more generally on the other, then we find in terms of non-sexual assault and non-sexual violence, men are by far the majority of victims. So if you look at homicide rates around the world, most victims are male. If you look at serious assaults that are not fatal, most of the victims are male. If you look at many of the human rights violations, serious human rights violations that take place around the world, including places like Kosovo and in South Africa, most of the victims have been, of the most serious forms of human rights violations, have been males. So there's a different profile, and we need to recognize the differences in that profile.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then there's also another topic that has to do with family laws, and you talk, for example, about the increased difficulty that men have in getting child custody, and also other aspects related to that. So could you tell us about that also?
Yes, so I think that in really patriarchal societies, men have got custody of children following divorce. It was a default that the male would acquire custody of the children. But that's no longer the case in the liberal democracies. There may be some parts of the world where it is still true, but in the liberal democracies, women are much more likely to get custody of children following divorce. And that's even when you control for relevant variables like who the primary child caregiver was prior to the divorce, and whether the application for custody is uncontested or not. So all those kind of variables, when you control for those, you still find that women are much more likely to get custody of children than men are, mothers more than fathers.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also a very interesting topic that you explore that has to do with education, because when we think about education, particularly at a worldwide level, let's say, we tend to think that there are many more places where girls get fewer years of education than boys do. But then there are other aspects of the education system that you focus on, where you say that boys are discriminated against. Could you tell us about that?
Well, yes, I certainly acknowledge that there are many parts of the world where girls are given much less educational opportunity than boys, and historically that's been true in even more places. What I point out, though, is that there are an increasing number of places in the world, again in the liberal democracies, where boys are doing less well than girls, and men are doing less well than females in many educational realms. Now, whether this is a product of discrimination or not is another matter. I'll return to that in a while. But if you look at the dropout rate, for example, from school, from university, the rate for males is much higher than for females. More bachelor's degrees are earned by females than by males. That's also now true of master's degrees. I think there's a parity at the doctoral level. So you do have various ways in which boys and men are disadvantaged. It doesn't follow that it's discrimination. But you see, here's the curious phenomenon that very often, and it's not true of all feminists, but very often, whenever feminists notice a disproportionality that favors men over women, they immediately leap to the conclusion that that must be the product of discrimination. Yeah. I think that sort of inference is a mistaken inference, because I think there might be perfectly innocuous explanations, sometimes, not always, but sometimes perfectly innocuous explanations for why you're going to get disproportionality. But if you do use that metric that they want to use, that disproportionality is indicative of discrimination, that you know now that a decisive indicator of discrimination, then you're going to have to say that where boys are dropping out at much greater rates, that's also a product of discrimination. So this is one of the instances where I'm not personally convinced that it is discriminatory. It may be, it may not be. I think there's a lot of complicated questions that need to be answered in order to reach a conclusion about that. But even in the absence of a conclusion about that, it's shedding some light on some of the claims that feminists routinely make.
Mm-hmm. So let's now talk a little bit about military service. What do you have to say about that in terms of the kinds of questions that we are exploring here? I mean, do you think that there's some sort of wrongful discrimination against men at the level of military service around the world?
I do. In some places, I think it's quite explicit. and that is to say where men are conscripted and women are not. Or where both sexes are conscripted, but there's a differential in the conscription in terms of how long they must serve or the roles that they must serve once in the military. So there's an explicit de jure form of discrimination. Now, what somebody might say in response to those sort of instances is, well, there are average differences between men and women that are going to make men better soldiers than women. And what I would say in response to that is that even if that's true on average, and I'm leaving an open question for now whether it is, but even if that's true on average, we don't think that sort of use of proxies is justified in other areas. So we don't think that we may, let's say, exclude women, or at least many of us, there's some people who do, but many of us don't think that we may exclude women from jobs as firefighters, for example, simply because on average women might be smaller and less strong than men. I think what we believe in these circumstances is that we ought to judge the individual by their own capacities rather than make a judgment on the basis of their sex. And I would say something similar with respect to conscription. If you really are justified in conscripting people, and I think there's a high burden that needs to be met for that, but if you really are justified in conscripting people, surely you should be doing it on more individualistic attributes, whether somebody would actually make a better or a worse soldier than do it on the basis of their sex. And then there are going to be more subtle forms of discrimination. So there are going to be lots of social pressures on men to sign up for the military even when they're not conscripted. That's certainly been true historically, whereas there have not been comparable pressures on women to do so. So, and these are pretty serious forms of, the discrimination results in pretty serious forms of disadvantage, because going into combat carries very, very serious risks of either death or severe injury, whether it be physical or mental.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand. And when it comes to the issue of imprisonment and the sentences that men and women get for different types of crime, is it the case that men tend to get higher sentences for the same type of crime across the world, or not?
Certainly in many places. I mean, one of the problems here is that we don't have even data across the world. There's some societies, and they tend to be wealthier societies, where these matters are researched much better than others. And they tend to be the liberal democracies. So it's very hard to make categorical judgments across the world. But men constitute the vast majority of prison inmates. It's in excess of 90%, I believe. And a lot of people will say, well, that's just attributable to the fact that men commit more crime. And more violent crime, more crime that is meriting, let's say, of imprisonment. And I think that accounts for part of it, although there might be upstream discriminatory factors that are contributing to why men are that disproportionately involved in criminal activity. But even beyond that, there is very good evidence, at least in some parts of the world, that at each node in the judicial system, men are treated more severely than women are, in terms of whether a decision is made about whether to prosecute, about the extent of the sentence, for example, that is imposed, the severity of the sentence that is imposed. So there is quite good evidence for that.
Mm-hmm. And there's a very interesting point there that I would like to explore a little bit more. So when you say that there might be upstream causes behind the fact that men commit most of the crime around the world, are you referring to, for example, the fact that there might be some sort of discrimination or at least disadvantage for men at a social, economic, political level or something like that? I mean, something that in their circumstances that cause them to commit more crime than women.
Yes, I think it's helpful perhaps to think about a female case first. So we find that women are underrepresented in certain professions. And feminists often point out, and I believe correctly, that at least part of that is attributable to the gender roles that children are socialized into. So if you constantly sending a message, and it might just be an implicit message to girls, that science is not for girls, then you shouldn't be surprised if you find fewer girls applying for and wanting to enter into science careers. So the discrimination is not taking place necessarily at the point of admission. That might be entirely gender neutral. But if you've got upstream discriminatory pressures, then that might partially explain why you've got different levels of male and female participation in some of the sciences. And I would say that something similar is true with respect to crime. Again, I can't say the extent to which this is accounting for the differences, but if there's more pressure on males than on females to be breadwinners, for example, or more pressure on males to engage in violence than on females, then you shouldn't be surprised if men resort to crime in order to feed their families, or resort to crime because they're more prone to violence, at least partially because of social conditioning. And so there's something that we should do about that. I'm not saying we should do something about it at the point of deciding whether a criminal should be sentenced to a prison term. You should obviously try to do that in as gender neutral a way as you can. But if you find that there are more men than women who are imprisoned, even when your sentencing decisions are entirely gender neutral, it may be that there's still some discrimination that's taking place upstream that you need to address.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into more general, broader questions, let me just ask you about one last example that you go through in the book. You talk about circumcision, and it's interesting because talking about feminism, the feminists are trying to raise awareness, and that's a good thing, I think, about female genital mutilation across the world and in different places. But then when it comes to circumcision, it seems that people don't tend to care that much about this type of ritual. I mean, I'm calling it ritual because it's usually associated with certain religions like Judaism and so on. So, I mean, there are different questions here that we can explore. The first one I would like to ask you is, because these types of practices, and focusing now specifically on circumcision, tend to be associated with religious rituals, do you think that that in some ways makes it less unethical to do so?
Well, let me say a few things about this. First of all, I think that female genital cutting, as it's usually practiced, is a lot more damaging than male circumcision as it is usually practiced. Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to prioritize, if you had to prioritize, and I don't believe you have to, but if you had to prioritize, it does seem more important to stop the female genital cutting than the circumcision. But there are a number of issues pertaining to circumcision. I don't believe that they center on whether the question is a religious one or not. That's not what differentiates it from female genital cutting, because a lot of female genital cutting is either religious or it's perceived to be a religious tradition. So that's not what separates it. What separates the two is, I think, more the severity of the intervention.
Okay.
I think often what you've got in the West is a kind of cultural familiarity and a cultural intolerance. So because female genital cutting tends to be practiced by the non-Western cultures, it's easy for them to lead to a negative conclusion about that. And because you've got male circumcision just so common in not all, but many Western societies, the United States would be the most prominent example, that it's so culturally familiar that they can't see what is problematic about it. Next, I'd want to point out that there can be a disagreement about the wrongfulness or otherwise of circumcision per se. So there are those who believe that removing healthy genital tissue, whether it be from a male or a female, is wrong. But there are others who think that there actually are some medical benefits to the male circumcision that there are not to the female genital cutting. And so it is possible to hold the view that that male circumcision is something that would be open to parental discretion, that parents could reasonably decide one way or another way. But even if you held that position, there's going to be a difficulty with performing neonatal circumcision in the absence of anesthesia. And that's the way it has historically been done. There might be some change in the trends now, but generally speaking, neonatal circumcision has taken place without anesthesia. At some point, that was justified by the belief that neonates didn't feel pain the way we feel, but the best science no longer shows that. The best science suggests that neonates are actually very capable of feeling pain. This is probably an excruciating surgical intervention without anesthesia. And one way in which I think we see the manifestation of the second sexism is that in societies such as the US, there's a complete intolerance even for very minimalist symbolic versions of female genital cutting, which involve the removal of no flesh at all, but merely drawing blood from the genital region, sort of a genital nick. So they oppose that, but they're happy to have the removal of genital tissue in a male without any anesthesia whatsoever. And that just looks like a complete double standard.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that another issue that we have here, another question that we can bring to the table, is the lack of consent in these types of practices?
Well, that's going to apply across the board. That would apply to female genital cutting performed on minors and to male circumcision performed on minors. The absence of consent, I don't personally think, is a categorical bar to an intervention. It's a more complicated matter than that, because if you think about other surgical interventions, if a child's got a cleft lip, for example, and the parents consent to that being repaired, it's appropriate for the parents to consent. But we don't think the child's inability to consent means that the surgery needs to be delayed until the child is, let's say, 18, reaches the age of majority. So I think the absence of child consent around circumcision really hinges on other issues, like whether this is a medical benefit or not. And if it's a medical benefit, whether it's more beneficial to have it done earlier rather than later. But I think we probably shouldn't go down this track, because this becomes now a discussion about the merits of circumcision per se, as opposed to the differential. And I think we can make a more general categorization that if circumcision is wrong and it's tolerated in males, but female genital cutting is not, then we have another powerful example of the second sexism. But even if you think that male circumcision is justified sometimes, even though female genital cutting is not, there might still be a form of second sexism if anesthesia is not used in the males.
Mm-hmm. So let me now move to more general questions. The first one would be, since you referred earlier to stereotypes that people hold about men and women, and the kinds of, some of the time at least, the kinds of negative consequences that they might have. I recently talked with Tanya Reynolds on my show. She is a social psychology postdoctoral researcher at the Kinsey Institute, and we talked. One of the topics that we explored was moral typecasting, and what she basically did in some studies was that she applied moral dyadic theory that was developed by Kurt Gray, where he distinguishes between intentional agents or perpetrators and suffering patients or victims, and then they go with that and try to understand what kinds of people tend to classify one way or the other. And she did several studies, and the results she got were that people tend to typecast men as intentional agents or perpetrators and women as suffering patients or victims. Do you think that this kind of knowledge could play an important role here? I mean, in terms of trying to understand what are the origins of certain types of discrimination, in this case against men?
I do think they could play a role. I'm not familiar with her particular research, although the findings are not at all surprising to me. I think this is an instance where we see how the first and the second sexism are actually interlinked. Because when you make these sorts of dyadic claims, where you assign men and women to these different attributes, or if you say that men are more this and less that, and women are more this and less that, you see how the two gender roles, as it were, are tied up with one another. So if you regard men more often as intentional agents and perpetrators, well, that's going to sometimes work to the advantage of men, but sometimes it's going to work to their disadvantage. So sometimes it'll work as a disadvantage because if a man is more readily seen as a perpetrator, then he's a more reasonable target when you're trying to eliminate somebody who might be a threat to you. Mm-hmm. And so often it's going to work to a male's advantage to be viewed as an intentional agent, and perhaps even as a perpetrator, because you might be in more fear of him and avoid him. At least some people might avoid him. But on the other hand, it can be to his disadvantage. And similarly, when women are viewed as suffering patients or as victims, that's going to often ignore their agency, and that's going to work to their disadvantage. On the other hand, it may protect them in certain ways. It'll protect them in the same ways in which children are protected. Not always, but sometimes in the same ways in which children are protected. So I do think that the first and second sexism are bound up with one another. And although they can be broken down at different speeds, as it were, which I think is what has in fact happened, I don't think you're ever going to entirely eliminate the first sexism without addressing the second sexism.
Mm-hmm. And let's say that the kinds of societal level stereotypes that people hold about men in this case, let's assume that they are correct and some of them at least have a biological basis. Like, for example, that men are in fact biologically more violent than women. I mean, we could expand on that a little bit. There's some evidence coming from disciplines like evolutionary psychology that points in that direction. I mean, if the stereotypes correspond to something real, like men being more violent than women, is it legitimate for us to hold those stereotypes and behave in accordance to them or not?
No, I don't think so. First of all, because I think what we are seeing in the difference in aggression and violence between men and women is not simply the product of biology. If biology plays a role, and it may very well play a role, it's likely that that has been exacerbated by social roles. So here's an hypothesis. The hypothesis is that there may be some natural differences in behavioral traits between females and males. People begin to recognize those, and then they've come to expect those traits from people of different sexes. And so now what you've got is a social expectation that's laid on to and exaggerates some basic biological difference. And then the resultant product that you see in terms of the different levels of violence isn't all attributable to biology. It's partially attributable to social expectations and social and gender roles. And so I would say that we shouldn't just accept this at face value. But even insofar as things are natural, we don't have to accept everything in nature. Sometimes nature can be channeled in certain ways, or it can be altered in certain ways. Modern medicine is about countering what would happen naturally to us in the absence of our intervention. We don't just say, well, you've got a malignancy, you're going to die. So if you've got a malignancy and there's something we can do about it, we're going to try and do something about that.
Another question. Feminists talk a lot about gender violence, that is about certain types of violence that they think are in some way or another gendered, that is, they are directed toward a particular gender. In that case, they refer to women. Do you think that we should use this term, gender violence, that it is really rigorous and that it helps us really understand and tackle the sorts of issues we are exploring here?
No, I do not think it's a helpful expression at all. It's code. It's code for violence against females. But if I'm correct in the things that I've said about violence against males, that's just another form of gender violence. So there are gendered profiles for violence. Most of the perpetrators of violence are male, but most of the victims are male as well. Most of the victims of sexual violence are female. So you've got these different profiles. But just to speak about gender violence as though that applied only to women and there was no gendered component to the violence against men, that's just ignoring at least half, if not more, of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think just a semantic revisal would be appropriate here. So if you had a campaign now which opposed violence against women, I'd say, well, that's perfectly fine, but why are we restricting it to women? Why don't we just be opposed to violence? I mean, are you really condoning or really tolerating violence against men? And I would actually broaden the point even more generally beyond our species to other species. So this fixation with some subclass, some subcategory of all the victims of the appalling violence that takes place in the world, I just don't understand why you would have that focus.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we already referred to that. Let's now talk about other objections put forth by feminists on a regular basis, I think. So the first one they talk about, they use the inversion argument. That is, they sometimes say that there are instances of discrimination against men that are instead forms of discrimination against women. Do you think that that really happens sometimes, or they are wrong there?
Well, they don't use that term. Inversion argument is a term I've used to describe what I think goes on. And it's not a formal argument in the sense that they are explicit about the inversion. I think that what they're actually doing is an inversion. And I've got variants where I have a hemi-inversion and a demi-inversion. But one example would be when feminists quite correctly criticize the exclusion of women in certain places from combat. So you've got women who want to serve in combat and they are excluded by some regulations or laws. And they point out that this is a form of sex discrimination, and I wholeheartedly agree with them. I believe that's inappropriate, that women who want to serve in those roles and who meet the requirements should be allowed to do so. But what they ignore is the other side of the problem. That is to say, there are very many more men who do not want to serve in combat, but who are forced into combat. So they're presenting a complex issue as though it were exclusively a problem of discrimination against women, when in fact there's a very large component of it that is a form of discrimination against men.
Mm-hmm. Then you also identify another type of argument in your book that you call the costs of dominance argument, and in this one they are not denying that there are at least certain instances where men are disadvantaged or discriminated against, but what they say instead is that these kinds of costs that men incur are sort of a byproduct of the fact that they are the privileged sex, that they have a dominant position in society. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think that is another common strategy. I just don't think it's true. And there are lots of arguments that one can give to show that. But perhaps a good example is the case of fathers' custody of children following divorce. So when you had the really patriarchal society, when you had the society where men were much more in control, then they would get custody of children. And as the patriarchy sort of diminishes, as you get more liberation of women, greater recognition of female rights, now men do not have that same advantage that they had before. In fact, the advantage works in the opposite direction. So it's very hard to say that the custody that women get of children following divorce in contemporary liberal democracies is a product of male dominance, because when males were more dominant, they never had that disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a last type of argument that you talk about that you call the distraction argument, where feminists basically say that talking about the kinds of discrimination that men are victim of, for example, is simply a maneuver, let's say, on the part of whoever, for example, men's rights activists, to distract people from the real problems that we have in society that are the ones that affect women, right?
Yeah, that is another argument that I think is often advanced. I don't accept the argument because I think it's possible to be opposed to more than one injustice at a time. So you can oppose discrimination against women, and you can oppose discrimination against men. And in fact, I think one of the most effective ways to oppose each of those forms of discrimination is by also opposing the other. First of all, you demonstrate your principled commitment to an opposition to sex discrimination. It doesn't look like it's a self-serving or selective opposition or a selective principle. If you're opposed to sex discrimination, you should be opposed to it across the board, so you demonstrate that. You're also going to create, I think, more allies if you're going to recognize that both sexes can be discriminated against, and you work together to counter discrimination against both sexes. But even if you thought that the forms of discrimination against women were worse than the forms of discrimination against men, there are going to be many societies where anti-female discrimination is not the biggest injustice in the society. There are going to be bigger ones. There might be ones based on race or on religious discrimination. There might be ones based on class discrimination. And if you really thought that you should only focus on the most pressing, the biggest injustice in the society, then there'd be many instances in which you shouldn't focus on discrimination against women. And I just think this is all inappropriate. What you should do is oppose discrimination and injustice wherever you see it. I don't see why you need to be selective. I understand that certain people might devote their energies to one cause rather than another. We've all got limitation in our capacity to work. So some people might work more on some issues than others. But when you're asked for your opinion about some of the others, it doesn't cost anything to say, I acknowledge fully the wrongfulness of that alternative treatment, and I don't oppose for a moment anybody who chooses to direct their efforts to that, as long as they also do that in the open-minded and even-handed way that I'm recommending. Mm-hmm. So I actually differentiate in the book between different kinds of men's rights groups and different kinds of feminists. People often want to portray me as a way of dismissing me as a men's rights activist. And I am in one sense, and I'm not in another. I do not support those sort of men's rights groups that want to deny that females are the victims of discrimination. I don't think that's true. I don't think that claim that they make is true, and I don't think that it's helpful as a result. But then I also am opposed to those feminists who really are only interested in advancing the position of women. They're not really committed to equality of the sexes. So I think that's a cheap shot that many people want to make. So it's often made against feminists. Somebody gets dismissed as a feminist, and it can also be made to dismiss somebody as a men's rights activist. I don't think we should be worrying as much about those labels as about somebody's actual commitments and interests.
Mm-hmm. So you already partially answered my next question, but let me ask you, in terms of feminism, I mean, of course, there are different forms of feminism, different waves, but would you say that there are at least some of those forms that we can say discriminate against men?
Yes, that qualified claim I would endorse, but I do not think that the problem of the second sexism is one that is caused by feminism. It long predates feminism. So feminism has not caused this problem. There may be some versions of feminism that have exacerbated it in some ways, but what I call egalitarian feminists, feminists who are really interested in gender equality and who will oppose discrimination on the grounds of sex, whether the victim is a man or a woman, those feminists, I think, pose no threat to men, and they're not discriminating against men.
Mm-hmm. Equality feminism, just to make it clear, you're referring to that term that Christina of Summers uses, and she distinguishes between that and what she calls gender feminism. Is that right?
Yes, I think I use slightly different terms from the ones she used. I don't exactly remember her terms. I refer to partisan feminists and egalitarian feminists.
Okay. I mean, let us just explore one last topic here. Perhaps it's a very broad question, but in terms of the different kinds of discrimination that men are victims of that we explored here, do you think that there are any general solutions that you would like to talk about in terms of how our societies function, in terms of certain decisions that our politicians could make, in terms of our cultural values that could really solve or at least alleviate some of these problems?
I think there are, in principle, things that could be done. Obviously, to bring about social change is very difficult indeed. So I don't think there are any recipes, as it were, that could bring about these changes, just as there be no recipes for bringing about a reduction in discrimination against women. I think part of the problem is that, in general, people think in too simplistic terms. So you get a campaign going where you oppose what people call gender-based violence, and people get on that bandwagon and they don't think very much about it and what it means. And I don't even know whether it results in a reduction of violence against women, because I'm not sure to what extent those campaigns do anything of that kind. They might raise awareness, but I'm not sure whether they actually deal with the real causes of these problems. And so to introduce nuance where you recognize that there are different profiles for violence against men and violence against women, this is not something that lends itself to slogans. It's not something that lends itself to mass movements. So I do think, though, that becoming aware of the problem is the first step. So you need to be aware of the multiple ways in which not only women but also men are the victims of discrimination. And then I would say address those in the sort of piecemeal ways that I've suggested. So if you need to conscript, don't do it on the basis of somebody's sex. If you're making decisions about whether to allow somebody into combat, don't do that on the basis of their sex. If you're wanting to make a decision, let's say, about an educational intervention, don't do that on the basis of a person's sex. Look at other variables. If there's evidence of bias in hiring decisions, whether it be, let's say, against females or against males, be aware of that bias and try to correct for it. But we need to be very careful in how we correct for it, because sometimes you can overcorrect, and then what you're doing is you're discriminating in the opposite direction.
Isn't there also a very big component, at least applied to some of these questions? So let's say, for example, in terms of the workplace and the gender pay gap and issues like that, don't you think that there's also a big question of the extent to which we should interfere with certain decisions that people make in their lives? So let's say, for example, that there's some discrimination against women, and that explains a percentage of the gender pay gap, but then we get to the conclusion that most of it derives from the fact that men and women simply tend to have different interests, they tend to prefer different academic pursuits, different professional occupations and things like that. I mean, what I'm trying to ask you here is that whenever we try to bring change to society, we tend to idealize how society should be. And in terms of gender discrimination, maybe there are some people that say that the only way for us to not be discriminating at all would be for us to have a perfect 50-50 split of both genders in all occupations, for example. But I mean, there's also an issue regarding people's liberty of choice here, right? If what I said is correct.
I agree, and the evidence that I've seen suggests that at least a large part of the wage gap is attributable to choices that are made, different choices that are made by men and women. Now, again, there may be some upstream discriminatory explanations for that, but the best place to address those is upstream, not downstream. So I do think that should put a high premium on people's liberty, on people's choices. To a certain extent, we have to let the chips fall where they do. But if there is upstream discrimination, then try to attend to that. But the sort of social engineering around equal number of men and women in each profession and at each pay grade, and I think that's a level of intervention that will often do more harm than good. It may create the appearance of equality, but it might in fact be increasing discrimination. Now, this is something that a lot of feminists are going to be very upset by, but then they need to think about situations in which women are underrepresented in unpleasant circumstances. So if you look, for example, at work fatalities, the vast majority of work fatalities are men. And you might say, well, it'd be perverse to say we need to have more female work mortalities, but we see almost no pressure to say this is just a sex discrimination outrage, and we need to bring down these rates. We don't see pressure in the judicial system to be convicting and sentencing to longer terms women because of the relative advantages that they have. And I don't think we should be making those interventions. But if you think that level of social engineering is inappropriate when men are on the receiving end of worse treatment, then you need to recognize what the implications are when women are.
So, Dr. Benatar, let's end the interview here then. I will leave a link in the description box of the interview for the book we focused on today. Again, the Second Sexism, Discrimination Against Men and Boys. Would you like to make reference to some places on the internet where people can find your work?
I'm not really on the internet very much, so I suppose I can just try Googling.
Okay. Anyway, I will also include some other links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting. And Dr. Benatar, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and I really loved the conversation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your interest and your time.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. There's also links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Sergio Condriano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingberg, Drs. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart. My three producers, Isar Weber, Rosie, and Jim Frank, and my executive producer, Michal Ruzieski. Thank you for all.